I really wanted to at least open that door to the conversation and hopefully bring this to light for people that may have not ever recognized that this history had been here for so long, that we had since the 1910s and 1920s, that for decades we've been impacting all the different musical genres, and that we're singing in Spanish and in English, and it's bilingual, and some of it's jazz, some of it's classical. I mean, we've had incredible talent in the Houston Symphony to rock and roll. So it was such a fun
Right.
project. And I had an incredible team of volunteers from the community, which says so much about how the archive can really work with the community to tell these stories. And so, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. It still is one of the highlights of my time at the library. And I just will forever.
It was a super, super
Yeah.
successful
Yeah.
exhibit.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Spotlight Houston, where we bring you the best of the people, places, and events in the greater Houston region. This week, we're replaying an episode that originally aired on January 29th, 2023. We sat down with Mikaela Selley, program manager for Arte Público Press's periodicals in the U.S.-Mexico region project. Mikaela shared her exciting work digitizing rare newspapers, preserving Hispanic history, and her experiences as an archivist and an independent consultant. Remember, we publish episodes every Monday. Spotlight Houston is a production of Story Zone Media. And now your host, Blanca Quesada.
Hi, I'm Blanca Quesada, and thank you for joining us here on Spotlight Houston. And today I'm so excited to introduce you to Mikaela Selley. She's an archivist extraordinaire. She's amazing. Yes, I said amazing because she is. She has found incredible stories that she'll be sharing with us today, and I can't wait to hear them. So welcome, Mikaela. Is it okay if I call you Mika?
Thank you for having me.
Perfect. So,
Yes, absolutely.
first of all, I'm interested in finding out, and I'm sure maybe some of our listeners might be interested as well, as to what inspired you to decide to become an archivist. Why, how, and especially focusing on the Hispanic community.
Yes, I definitely was not a child running around saying I'm going to be an archivist when I grow up. So I went to the University of Houston, and I knew I wanted to write and use that skill somehow, but I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. And I ended up having the opportunity as a work study student to land a job in the archive at the University of Houston Central Campus. I had never stepped foot inside of an archive. I was very familiar with libraries, but archives were something that I really didn't know much about. And so it opened up what I thought was just this is just going to be my job, help me pay for school, really led into my introduction to this world of historic preservation and the power of records and documents and photographs and what it means to preserve one community's history and how to share these materials. So I'm forever grateful for that opportunity. And I fell in love with just the concept of preserving history and sharing it in that way. And from there, I learned that there's degrees that you can get in this field. And so then I went on to get a master's in public history at the University of Houston. And that's where you learn a little more about how to engage with the community through history projects like exhibits, like oral histories, like museum projects, all kinds of things. And so yes, I was introduced to archives as a college student, and then it turned into a passion and a career.
Yeah, it's definitely a passion for you because I've witnessed it. And then you went to the Houston Public Library where there hadn't been anyone in years researching the Hispanic community.
So yes, Houston Metropolitan Research Center, which is one branch of the Houston Public Library, has an incredible collection of what are called the Hispanic collection. So these are hundreds of boxes of records. And this collection, this focus on Houston's mostly Mexican American community, began in the 70s with an archivist that was there who felt the need to address a gap in the collection. Hey, we should be collecting from our Black and Brown communities in Houston. So he started this incredible collection. His name was Dr. Tom Krennick. And then when he moved on to another archive and left the library, there was a gap where there wasn't an archivist dedicated to those collections. And then for a short period, Dr. Carolina Villarroel was an archivist at Houston Metropolitan Research Center, and she kind of picked up where he left off and made some great progress. And then she moved on to a different archive. And so as these things happen, these materials were, there was, like you mentioned, there was a gap where there wasn't a paid full-time position dedicated to these materials. And that's an important distinction to make because it is a lot of work.
Yeah, definitely.
It is a lot of work to decide that you're going to have a position dedicated to a certain community. It's very powerful. It becomes a powerful resource to address the preservation of that community's history. And so when I stepped in, I was trying to understand what had happened during those gaps, what had been collected before me. How do I continue that progress? How do I, re-energize that momentum that once was? And so it was really exciting to step into that moment.
Well, you increased the collection there. And not only did you manage to increase the collection, but you managed to now include oral history with it. And you went out to people's homes, wherever you could, to talk to different people. A lot of the veterans, the Hispanic veterans that are usually never mentioned in history, and they were part of the wars. And I remember meeting some that were in their 90s. And they were incredible people. And then the other thing that I remember you doing that was huge was an exhibit on Hispanic music in Houston, how it started here in Houston and who basically some of the artists were.
Yeah, that was such a special project. That took place in 2019, just before the pandemic. It was what would become one of my final exhibitions while working at the Houston Public Library. And it was dedicated to, as you said, the complex and vibrant and diverse music history that Latinos have in Houston. And of course, there's no way to tell all the stories or hit all of the genres, but I really wanted to at least open that door to the conversation and hopefully bring this to light for people that may have not ever recognized that this history had been here for so long, that we had since the 1910s and 1920s, that for decades we've been impacting all the different musical genres, and that we're singing in Spanish and in English, and it's bilingual, and some of it's jazz, some of it's classical. I mean, we've had incredible talent in the Houston Symphony to rock and roll. So it was such a fun project. And I had an incredible team of volunteers from the community, which says so much about how the archive can really work with the community to tell these stories. And so, I'm glad you mentioned that. It still is one of the highlights of my time at the library. And I just will forever.
It was a super successful exhibit. I mean, you could hear people's music from back when, and then you had an incredible collection as well.
Yes. It was using the materials housed at the archive. And presenting them in a way that made them accessible. So an archive is there, and researchers and students are very familiar with how to access an archive for the most part. But an exhibit is such an incredible way to really introduce these things to a wider audience, an audience that may not step foot into an archive. And so that's exciting on its own as well. And so, it was a great.
Yeah. And also how women were making a difference in music as well.
That was really special to highlight women like Lidia Mendoza. And one particular document that we had on display that always stays in my mind is her contract with RCA, a recording company. I believe it's dated from the 1930s. I could be wrong. It's been so long, but it was a pre-written sort of contract, template. And so all the language in it was written for men. So there was a lot of he and him. And even though it was signed by Lidia Mendoza, like she had to use this template because they weren't using a contract that had language for a female recording artist. So I thought that was really interesting. It kind of said a lot about the time. And I mean, certainly other women were making music, but it was an interesting point that I think hit home about women in the industry.
Yeah. Didn't she also get a letter from a president?
Yes, I believe so. I think that was on display as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that. It's like, wow, she got recognized by the president of the United States, So,
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
yeah, well, congratulations. I remember that exhibit and it was great.
Thank you.
It
Thank
was
you.
great. So now you are program manager for a digitization project that you're working on, which is recovering U.S. literary heritage program.
Yeah, I now work for an incredible team at Recovering the U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage Program, which is sort of the archival and research division of Arte Público Press, housed at the University of Houston. Arte Público Press, one of the oldest publisher of contemporary and recovered literature by U.S. Hispanic authors. It was founded in 1989 by Dr. Nicolás Canelos and moved with him to the University of Houston, where it has been ever since. And then in 1992, Arte Público Press launched the Recovery Program, which is an international program to recover, index, and share Hispanic literary history, but also just Hispanic history in the U.S. in general. And it's an incredible project. I joined the team about a year and a half ago to specifically manage a digitization project called Periodicals in the U.S.-Mexico Border Region. So we received a grant from CLEAR, which is the Council on Library and Information Resource. And that grant was to support the Periodicals in the U.S.-Mexico Border Region project. And the goal is to digitize 200 rare newspapers
Wow.
from across the U.S.-Mexico border and then make them available on a brand new website, available to the public. And it's going to be completely indexed and everything's scanned and will be searchable. And we're in the middle of digitizing right now and creating all of the metadata that's going to help searchable. And the time period for these materials, 1800s through 1950s. And these are, some are in English, some are in Spanish, some are bilingual. And what we're finding are incredible gems in this project. Lots of newspapers that reflect early feminist writers from South Texas. We've got a lot of interesting newspapers that were specifically published to showcase the sort of anarchist perspective. There were a lot about the Mexican Revolution and showing the perspective on the Tejano, the Texas side, and the Mexican side. So a really fascinating collection that we're excited to bring to the public this spring, actually. We'll launch soon.
And how are you getting a hold of this material?
Yes, that's a great question. So Recovery Program acquires donations from people in a variety of ways. So through sort of word of mouth and through making contacts in the community and kind of the snowball effect of, oh, I know someone who knows someone. Recovery has acquired several rare newspapers, their original print, and several that I've put my hands on are actually from descendants of publishers, right? So there's these grandkids who have held on to this material and are now wanting to preserve it and make sure that it gets preserved, is accessible, which is a beautiful thing. And then Recovery also acquires microfilm collections, or if other archives are not able to host a website or scan them, Recovery has made incredible connections with other archives and libraries in creating these sort of collaborations where let's help you scan, let's help you get these out into the public. And, we've got the equipment, we've got the methodology and the process. So the Recovery Program has really set such an incredible standard for how to collaborate and then how to get this out to researchers.
Right. So have you or anybody in your team gone out to maybe some of these border towns or cities?
Sure. So I myself have not, but the director of research for the Recovery Program is Dr. Carolina Villarroel, who I happened to mention earlier, which is small world.
Yeah.
But she has done a lot of the traveling. In fact, she recently came back from El Paso with a gem. We were really excited to open this box and find a bound publication, a Spanish language newspaper from the 1930s, where the cover is starting to crumble, but you open the inside and
Wow.
the newsprint itself is thankfully so well intact. And so we're excited to get to work on scanning that. And
what kind of stories are found in these newspapers?
so it varies. So there's some, newspapers that you've got your normal sort of daily news, regional news. And then there's a lot that we're finding that have so much political satire, or you've got a lot of publishers using pseudonyms if they were perhaps speaking against the Mexican government or so you've got a really interesting mix. And I think, what makes this project so valuable is that it touches on so many different studies. So if there are people looking at border studies or feminist studies, if you're looking at linguistics even, it's so interesting to see how people were writing, right? Spanish, just like any other language, kind of changes over time. You use different slang, different words. There have been several words I've come across that I just really had no idea what they meant. They're so outdated. So it's an incredible project. And I think it's really going to be useful for a broad spectrum of research.
Yeah, it sounds like it's going to be very important, not just for Hispanics, but everyone. And also, I think it's valuable for the community here in Houston. But it also sounds like it would be something that would be important for the nation.
Absolutely. I'm really glad that you said that point, because it's important that everyone know this history. Hispanic history is not just for Hispanics. This is a U.S. history. This is for all people to understand this community that is very much a part of the American fabric, and it's for everyone. And so, which is why, we're really excited about making this. It's not going to be subscription based, or it's not a program limited to just university students. It will be for the general public. So yeah, thank you for making that point. I think it's really important.
Yeah. And are you collecting any current publications?
We do have materials that are, I guess, as an archivist, current would be like 80s, 1980s, 1990s. But yeah, so we definitely receive collections that are more current, and they're not exactly part of this particular digitization project, but we're definitely preserving them nonetheless, knowing that we're moving so quickly, and in just a few years, they'll need to be made accessible as well.
Yeah. You've been mentioning digitization as a project. So what does that really mean? Does that mean that you're going to include photos, oral histories? What all does that include?
Yeah. So digitization, sort of at its very basic definition, is just converting something into a digital file so that you can share it on the web or through the computer.
You can read it.
Right. You can read it. And so we digitize to provide access. And so if we have a print, a newspaper, an original print, for example, that involves arranging the newspapers in chronological order if they're not already. So that's kind of what we call processing a collection. So there's prepping the material beforehand. We check for any preservation issues. Is this damaged in any way? Does it need some repair before we scan it? Is there mold? Is there anything that we need to address to save this item before we take a photo of it? Once it's ready, we then scan it. We have large format scanners. So if anyone's familiar with their copy machine, their scanner and the copy machine, this is a much larger machine, and it's capable of getting really high quality images. We want people to be able to zoom in and zoom out as much as they can. And so what we're doing when we scan is we're creating a preservation file that we keep, not for really anybody to use, but it's simply that backup copy so that we have it. And then we create a file that is actually going online. So there's several steps in the process, and we've got a team of graduate students helping in every step. And then, of course, we describe the item so that you can search for it. And so it's many steps in the process.
So if anyone in the community has a collection of these types of publications, can they donate them to you?
Yes, absolutely.
How?
So if you visit our website, artepublicopress.com/recovery-program, you'll find more information about us and how to contact us. And we are happy to schedule a talk, either in person or Zoom. And we're happy to visit with you and talk about all of the different options. One of the unique aspects of Recovery Program as an archive is that we really focus on digitization, and we we work with people, especially who are not necessarily interested in donating the physical copies of their materials. Let's say there's a lot of people that want to keep the physical copy in their family, but they do want to share them, and they do recognize that, maybe preserving them digitally.
Well, they're important.
Exactly. So recovery often will work with people to digitize and help that family preserve them in archival containers and boxes and folders, and then return it to the family. And so we're able to share the valuable material, and the family is then able to care for their collections that they've been preserving all this time. And so it's an incredible program, and we are definitely excited to hear from people and happy to answer questions about the process.
Well, it sounds very interesting, but everything you do is interesting.
I think so too.
So I always like to talk to you because you have all these stories of people that when the Hispanic community first started growing in Houston, you told me a very special story one time about this Hispanic family in, I think it was an Italian community. And the gentleman started a business and he was selling tortillas. And everybody was telling him nobody's going to buy tortillas because these people have never eaten tortillas, right?
Yes. So that is the interesting story of the Gomez family. They opened 3 businesses on Washington Avenue in the 1700 and 1800 block. So very close to Houston Avenue, that strip where you see all of those restaurants and bars today. And they opened these businesses between the 1930s and the 1960s. And one of them was one of the first successful tortillerias, so tortilla factory. And there's oral history interviews with the daughter of Melesio Gomez, who founded the tortilleria. And she's in the interview, she says, "My father never made a crooked tortilla." And she says it so proudly, and you can hear the pride in her voice and how her father took pride in his work. And then she goes on to tell the story. As you said, Washington Avenue at that time, there was a small and growing Mexican American community, but it was pretty diverse. There were Italians, there were several other communities represented. And so he began to teach the other sort of grocers how to use tortillas so that he could convince them to sell tortillas. So he worked with wine gardens, and he worked with, if you remember, the pig stand.
Oh, yes.
Teaching them what is an enchilada, what is a tamal, what are all the cool things that you can
Tacos.
do with a tortilla. And she recalls bringing in the Boy Scouts and how all these little kids would come in and they had no idea what was going on. And so to convince them to eat a tortilla, they would have Coca-Cola ready for them so that they would be willing to try a tortilla. So it's such a fascinating history, kind of glimpse into Houston's diversity, the food history, and sort of already you can see the blending of food, right? We now are in an era of fusion tacos and all of that. And
yeah,
you can go all the way back and see some of these early entrepreneurial families in Houston really creating and thriving in every area in Houston. Yeah.
Well, as an independent consultant, what type of materials are you looking?
Yeah, so I am interested in helping with research. So I offer research services. As an archivist, I am very familiar with how to find sort of those hidden gems inside of an archive and collection. And then I also help to tell stories through exhibit. So I've got a job that I'm working on right now where this organization wants to tell the story of how a family's history really intertwines with their community center history, and they want an exhibit. So I'm in the archive looking for this family's history and meeting with the family to look at their personal collection of photographs and designing sort of a timeline and how do we want to present this history and how do we make it accessible. And so I also help organizations process their collection. And what that means is helping to organize those boxes, helping to arrange material and understand, what are the preservation needs, as I mentioned before, looking at materials and checking for their condition and how fragile are they and what can we do to save these. So I love to go in and help people, whether it's a family or a business, with that, what can be sort of an overwhelming process to go through records and figure out what to do with them and how to save them. We live in a very humid city with all kinds of
Yes.
crazy weather. And so that is, that impacts people saving their materials. And so that's one aspect of the work that I offer as a consultant.
I think what you do is very important because a lot of times the Hispanic community doesn't know its history here in Houston or nationwide. And so you bring that history into the community. And especially for children, children go to school, they hear the history of all these other communities, but sometimes they don't hear about the Hispanic community and the difference that it's made in the way the cities have grown,
Absolutely.
what their contribution has been.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a lot of work being done in Houston. I know so many fellow archivists and museum specialists and librarians who are really trying to fill that gap and trying to work with educators on how to make this stuff accessible and how to really engage with children around these topics and how to make, history is so personal. And so how could we send that message home to our students?
Hmm. So if anybody wants to get in touch with you because they have materials that they think are important to share, how can they do that?
And yes, so I do have a website. It is mikaelaselley.com. And on there is a contact page where you can contact me and we'll schedule a meeting. And I'd love to hear from people and see how I can help. There's a lot of great resources in Houston, and I'm excited to connect and talk.
I think it's important for people to share whatever materials they might have
Yes,
because that can make a difference.
absolutely.
And each family, each person is important. All of us, I think, put our own little grain of salt or sand into the patchwork, you could say, of a city, right?
Yes, that's beautifully said. It's not just about collecting. I think there's this misconception about, there's this need to only collect those that did huge and noticeable things, right? But that's
Right.
not the case. The history of Houston, as you said, is filled with all of these stories from all kinds of people, whether they made it in the newspaper or not.
Yeah, a city wouldn't be a city without every person that lives there. They don't have to be famous or well known or anything, but it doesn't matter what you did, you were contributing somehow. And we still to the growth of our cities.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
So can you mention that website again?
Yes. So my website is mikaelaselley.com. So that's MikaelaSelley. My first name and last name.com.
Well, Mikaela, thank you so much for being on Spotlight Houston. I always learn a lot more from you, so I can't wait to hear more next time I see you. So I hope you do come back.
Yes. Thank you for having me. I would love to come back.
Yeah, because there's so much more to talk about,
Yes.
more stories. And so I would like to thank y'all as well for joining me on Spotlight Houston. And I hope you join me again soon.